Welcome, friends. Here we are, and I am telling you, I'm so excited. I've got my lovely co-host, Kim Geiken, here with me, the client who became a mediator. And, I've got to tell you, I'm actually a little starstruck that I have this award-winning filmmaker, Ellen Bruno, with us today. And Ellen, we're going to talk about your movie Split, and that is about kids going through divorce. And that's why the listeners want to be here. But I always like to get a little information about people, and you inspire me. And I'm not saying that lightly. I am 53 years old and maybe have just started caring about a little bit more than my little pod here. And when I look at your website, Bruno Films, and you're a humanitarian. You have so many touching stories and films. Can you, because I'm so in awe of that, can you just, and I'm not kidding, but can you just give us a little bit of the detail of what made you do this in your life? It's awesome.
Well, thank you. That's very sweet. And I in turn am very inspired by the kind of work you're doing. So I've got to say that. And it's funny. Recently, I had one of those middle of the night realizations where I thought, well, if I could do it over, I would seriously consider mediation. There's something about mediation that is so profoundly healing for this world and for the people in this world. And it's so I want to say that I have deep admiration for people that are working to bring people together in whatever way. And so
I just want to tell you too, Ellen, it's not too late. You could
yes.
could do it.
I do think about that. And anyways, more on that later. But I don't know. Ever since I was a kid, the truth is I was one of those kids that was obsessed with National Geographics and other cultures and things beyond the little bubble that I grew up in. I come from a very small Italian community in Rhode Island, and our horizons weren't very far. And so and then starting early in the game, I ended up spending my high school years, my summers in Mexico with one of my teachers. And then I had one of those moments that, oh wow, I'm 14 years old and I know exactly what I want to do with my life. And, what that meant in my 14-year-old mind was, working in a community, working in a shared effort to make things better for people in that community. And so in a strange sense, after about 8 or 10 years of refugee relief, I then transitioned into filmmaking somewhat reluctantly because apparently I'm a good storyteller. And
you are.
So, there's this way that sometimes we have an idea of things we think we should do in the world. And then there's sometimes the universe is sort of pointing us in a particular direction and we go somewhat reluctantly. And I've got to admit, I was somewhat reluctant to leave direct service and go into filmmaking because it's pretty all encompassing. I have managed to keep a foot in both worlds, and I'm very engaged in a lot of non-filmmaking efforts, and I travel quite regularly to work on projects outside of filmmaking. So, yeah.
Well, and I think that what you're doing is so important because you're doing the work and you're reaching other people like me and like people like my clients who get to see your film. And I think it's so amazing that at the age of 14, you knew. And I don't want to say I'm jealous, but I'm a little jealous because I think it took me until I was about 48 years old to just be hit over the head with it. So that's why you've been able to move the way you have and have the films that you do. And I recommend, we will have your website in our show notes. I recommend, people looking at your documentaries. And then that kind of brings me to Split.
Mm-hmm.
And let me ask you, you're traveling around the world doing all these amazing things. And then this one is a little different. It's here and it's about kids going through divorce. What made you do that?
Well, my parents got divorced when I was about 12, and there were 4 kids and in our family. And like I say, that was at a time in the 60s when parents felt like the best thing they could do for kids was to not mention it and not talk about it, as though we didn't notice. It was like, don't talk about it so the kids don't get upset. But of course, the moms would kind of file into the kitchen and sit over a cup of coffee and sob and, oh, you poor woman, oh, you poor children, and so, but we had no outlet to talk about it. And it was a time when we had a lot of shame. We were the only kids, or just one of 2 or 3 kids in the entire school whose parents were separated. And then 30 years later, my kids' dad and I separated when the kids were quite young. And when they got to school, I realized, wow, 30 years later, and the culture of divorce really has not changed much in our society. And there's still a lot of stigma and shame, and there's still a lack of true communication about what's happening. And, there's this way that parents are so overwhelmed, understandably so,
Yes.
and they're in the midst of a divorce that, they'll say, Kathy, how are you doing? And, oh, I'm okay, Mom, and it's almost like the parents can't tolerate to hear the truth of how this is affecting their children. And it's almost like the kids can't tolerate telling their parents because they see how burdened and overwhelmed their parents are. And so there's this very unfortunate conspiracy of silence that happens still around divorce, where everybody's busy taking care of each other, but nobody's really getting their needs met. And we're in a legal structure where there's so much attention and intention and attention to the needs of the children. But in reality, where are the children's voices in the process? Who's really hearing from the children? And so this was really just an effort to create a film that I felt I would feel good about my kids watching, a film that didn't feel creepy or didn't feel preachy, that was sort of fun, and the kids were cool and they're funny and they're giving it to you straight. And, kids can identify with the kids in Split in a way that really helps normalize it and realize it's very encouraging, because it's like, wow, those kids are cool. Yes. And I trust those kids because they're not giving me a sugar-coated version of everything's going to be okay. They're telling me, you know what, look, this is tough. There are things that are really tough about it. And there are things that are actually good about it that are unexpected. And in the end, we're going to survive, and we're going to be happy, and we're going to be able to make jokes, and we're going to be able to, re-enter the world as whole children. And that's something that's hard to imagine at the beginning of the journey for a child. And so there's this real trust that gets developed between the kids in the film and the viewer kids.
Yes.
It's like, I trust these kids. That's what kids have said to me so often is, oh, I really trust those kids. I really listen to them. The adults are always telling us this, and the adults are always telling us that. But, kids listen to other kids a lot more deeply than they do to us as adults or parents.
Well, and Ellen, the thing that's so interesting, so I don't have a lot of connection with the kiddos, right? But I think in addition to it being so therapeutic for them, I'm throwing that in the face of my clients because they are forgetting. They are forgetting what their kids are going through. And sometimes they don't like it and they get mad at me because they want to pretend, oh, it's going to be okay. And it is going to be okay. But I'm so thankful that I have, that film now that I can share with my clients, because that it's interesting. You created it for children, and I'm using it for their parents so that they understand and can share it with them and see what they're going through, because it is not easy. And you talked about that overwhelm, and that is like the process of mediation. We want to help with that overwhelm, but when they're in it so deep, it's hard to swim and see what your kids are going through. Exactly. But I am telling you, those kids are darling, and I cried. It was touching and sad at points, and yet hopeful, right? Just, like things you have to go through. But I took little notes about things that hit me. And I think they're little tips that our listeners can hear to help them help their kids. And I think One of the quotes I wrote down was, "It's like something you really love breaks and you can't put it back together."
Mhm.
Oh, that's how they feel. Like, don't forget that. They didn't ask for this. And then I was struck by how they all wanted to know why.
Exactly.
And if you can speak on that
Yeah.
a little bit.
Well, again, there's this way that in a way, I think we tend to overprotect our children or not give them the respect they're due in terms of straight talk. And what ends up happening, and when kids aren't getting the information they need, and granted, 8-year-old kids can't hear everything and they shouldn't hear
Right.
everything, but they are in the process, as are both parents, of recreating their story. They need to have a story to tell. It's like this emotional structure of the story to tell in order to move forward. Okay, what's going on here? How did this happen? What does this mean for me? And there's something that's very frightening for kids if they're kept in the dark. And I speak from personal experience. When I was going through this at the age of 12, clearly my parents were very upset. They'd go into their bedroom, they'd come out, they were both crying, very upset, and would say, "What's happening? What's happening?" "Oh, nothing's happening. Everything's okay. Let's go get ice cream." And I thought, I actually thought, I'm dying. I thought that I was dying and they did not want to tell me. And
Oh,
so, and because every time I'd say, "What's wrong?" they would say, "Nothing's wrong, nothing's wrong." And then they'd be like really nice to me. And I thought, so in my child's mind, I constructed the story that I had some incurable disease and they were afraid to tell me. And I actually ran out of school one day to my pediatrician's office and insisted on talking to him and said, "I deserve to know what's going on with me." And he's like, "What are you talking about?" And so that's all to say that children have very active imaginations and they're going to construct a story based on the pieces of information they have. And chances are that's going to be a very inaccurate and far more painful story than the reality. And there's something that's very grounding and it makes children very secure if they know their parents are being straight with them.
yep.
And it's very frightening when you feel like you have to figure it out on your own, or you have to be sort of a spy and put the pieces together. And there's a lot of that going on. And granted, I have to say, all with good intention. What's very interesting about the film is that, and what you're saying is very true. We made this for children, but it's being incredibly helpful for anybody working with separating parents, because at the time when parents are separating, they're almost unable to hear what their child's reality is. It's almost intolerable for them. Even in the absolute best of circumstances, divorce or separation is a major game changer for children. And children, it is true, very often feel it's their own fault because everything else in their entire life, in their family structure, it was directly related to them. Our family structures are obviously very child-centered. And so everything happens in relation where the child is a significant part of it. So why would divorce be any different?
Right.
So children really do feel like there's something they may have done. My sound recordist, when we were making the film, we left one of the homes and he said, "When I was 10, my father sat down at the kitchen table and turned around and said, 'That damn fish tank makes so much noise.' And then the next day he actually left the family." And so Jeremiah spent his life until
Wow.
he was a young adult thinking that his father left because his fish tank made too much noise. It's just the way children's minds work. So it's when parents are going through the process, the most Googled phrase that has divorce in it is the effect of divorce on children.
Yep.
Okay, so that's a significant piece of information. Parents are keenly concerned about how what they're doing is going to affect their children. However, they don't have the bandwidth necessarily to do
Yep.
much about it. And they don't have, they're so raw that they almost can't hear from their own children how this is affecting them. But what happens with split is enough degrees of separation from their actual children so that they can actually let the information in. It's not their children speaking to them directly, but they do recognize their children in the split kids. And so it's a comfortable enough distance to be able to show it to a parent, have them take it in, and have them, hopefully shift their behavior and their choices in a way that truly are most in support of the kids. and mostly supported themselves in the long run. As we all know, these contentious, acrimonious separations hurt the parents as much as the kids.
Yeah.
You know, they get caught in the toxic loop as much as the kids do, and everybody's happier
Yep.
if parents make more skillful choices, guided by people like you.
Oh, amen. Yeah. And yeah. And I just to kind of round that up, I mean, just for parents to know that most kids want to know what's happening, not the gory, icky details, but they want to understand it so that they're not lost. And many of them, which was in the film, and you just stated, fear that it's their fault. And so
Right.
to be able to communicate that to them, you are leaps and bounds ahead.
And trust that they're going to be okay. Trust the kids' capacity to take in
Yeah.
that information.
That's a good point.
We don't trust our kids enough. And the fact is, they're going through a lot of turmoil, emotional, psychological turmoil. Getting some straight talk will actually calm them down. It
Yeah.
will actually feel like they can trust the situation rather than being adrift at sea and not having any idea. Now, granted, you can't tell them what their life is going to look like 6 months from now because the whole family's going through a lot of changes.
Right.
But you can say you will see both parents, you will see your grandparents, you will still have your friends. Maybe the housing is going to change. You know, we may have to
Right.
move somewhere. I may have to get a job and work more than I did when we were together. But don't worry, we're going to be okay. We're going to work on this together. And you know, there's a way that, you know, as you know, there's a lot of anger in a sense of my kids need to know what really happened. My kids need to know that my wife took off with another guy and that this was not my fault. There's this sense of, and I'm bringing that up because that's inappropriate information to share with a child. That is not helpful for a child.
No.
You know, children really need to be allowed to love both parents and have access to both parents, because another universal truth, many came forth in the process of making this film, but a very profound universal truth is that a child really is half of both parents.
Yes. Ellen, I was just thinking that. Yes.
So to badmouth a parent is so hurtful to a child. It's so hurtful. And it's not helpful. It's not telling them the way things are so they know, they need to know whose fault this was. You know, children are very tender and loving to both parents, even if and they're not, children are not, they're really paying attention. They get what's happening with one parent or another. They get that one parent may be problematic in one way, or maybe picking fights more, you know, making things difficult. They're not blind. They're very keenly aware of what's going on in the relationship between their parents. They don't need to hear it from the parents. They're witnesses to that. And one of the a universal truth that came forth is how really devastating this conflict is for the kids. And how really they feel stuck in the middle. They feel like they need to caretake the parents. They need to be the peacemaker, the middleman, you know. So sending messages back and forth with the kids is just an untenable burden for these kids. They need to be free of that kind of responsibility of caretaking a parent. And
you know, Ellen, to that point, I always want to let parents know too, if they're listening and they're like, oh crap, I was saying really bad things. You know what I mean? Okay, it's not too late.
Exactly.
Go apologize. We all make, you know, we don't need to carry the shame around, but you can change it.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
And in something that's come out with the second round of interviews when the kids get older it was very interesting to me, is that it's very important for kids, and my kids, this is very true as well. What happens the way parents describe relationships in very negative ways, the kids are thinking, why am I even here? How was I born of this relationship that was so acrimonious? And kids need to know they came from love. It is so important. So many kids, they have a photograph of their parents when they were together in their room, or of them with their parents when they were together. They need to know that they were born of love. Now, granted, that's not always the case, but it is 90% of the time. And that is a core and precious part of their self understanding, that I came out of a loving relationship. Okay, then it got hard, or then we went separate ways, or however you tell the story after. But for a child to know that, I really did love your father, or we really had 5 or 10 great years together, and then it is really critical to a child's sense of well-being and sense of who they are.
And I think to their future relationships too.
Exactly.
That for me has been such a big point with my own kids, having gone through a divorce, is trying to get them to understand that not all marriages have to end in divorce. They do take work, and it is work, and it's important, and you can have that. And, I try to explain to them, the foundations of good relationships, and hopefully that they have these things, or to give them the tools to communicate effectively, and not in even just romantic relationships, but all of their relationships. So I'm trying to explain that to them at each of their different age groups and their levels, and how it can portray to different parts of their life. But that's a big deal for me. Like, I don't want, just because they came from parents that ended up getting divorced, that had a really good run, but, that they don't also walk into a marriage thinking, my parents had a good divorce, so if it doesn't work out, I can also get divorced. I hope that they are armed with the tools to have great relationships going forward.
That is such a great point.
It's interesting, because as I do these interviews and as we're finishing the sequel now, there are just certain stories that emerge as clearly, okay, this is a theme, and here's another theme, and here's another theme. And this, in fact, is one of the themes, is how these kids think about their relationships based on having been in the family where parents separated. And all of the kids talk about this. Some of the kids are very realistic, saying, I know relationships are hard. One girl said, the way I see it is, it's like under construction forever. That's how relationships are. Another one says, I can't imagine myself ever getting married. I can't imagine wanting that after I saw what happened with my parents. And another one says, I don't believe in that form, but, if I'm with somebody I trust and we communicate well, then that's a good enough fairy tale for me. And so what we need to understand, and this is a really important point, is we're not just trying to get our kids through this particular point when we're separating. We're actually creating the blueprint for how they see relationships and what they see as possible for themselves in the future. And so even if we're modeling a good separation, it's critical that we do that well. Whatever we do, we need to really be thinking long term, because divorce is not something that happens in a child's world when they're 12 and then 2 years later they're done with that and they get on with their lives. It's a pretty critical part of the structure of who they are and how it has a profound impact, and it could even be a good impact. I'm not saying divorce, the separation is always bad, and I'm not making judgments about that. But it is a game changer in whatever way it changes. And parents really need to realize that how their children experience their divorce has so much to do with how the parents behave, how the parents communicate with each other, and the choices they make. And that will create the experience for their child. And that can be an incredibly stressful, anxiety-producing situation for a child with a lot of pain, or that could be a learning and growth experience, where they're being loved and supported, and they're seeing two people who are using their higher selves to make choices for the entire family as that family moves through a transition. And so there needs to be something that we do as a culture. We need to start shifting how we do this as a culture. And Gwyneth Paltrow, I've got to say, despite all of the pokes and jabs she gets, in terms of her conscious uncoupling, is a critical concept that we need to learn in this culture. Yes, and it's unfortunate because the culture doesn't support that, and I can say for myself that when I was going through a divorce, my friends and family, with the best of intentions, would constantly be saying, "Oh yeah, he's being a jerk," or "Yeah, I can't believe he's acting that way," or "You're," and they felt that the way to support me would be to denigrate my kid's dad.
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
it still happens. I still find when people make comments about my kid's dad that it hurts me,
Mhm.
and I thought, this it's not necessary. This is my children's father. Yeah, we're not together. We had a parting of ways, but this is a person that I had two children with and that is dear and loved by my children. It's not helpful for you to be speaking so negatively about him. And yet it's what our culture dictates as a way to be supportive.
Right.
And
And you
it's
don't
almost like
have
eating
to.
too much candy. It's like, and then you just feel sick after it. It may feel good, like, oh yeah, they agree with me, he's a jerk. And then where does that get you?
Yeah. Oh, Ellen, I love your heart. I love that comment. And that is what I want for all my clients. I want them to have that relationship with the other parent. Um, yeah, that's so meaningful. And I have to ask you something that I got really excited about. Do you have a sequel? Do we get to see what these
Yeah.
kids are doing when they grow
Yes.
up?
Yes, you do, and very
Oh, good.
soon. Yeah, no, it's very exciting. There's 12 kids in Split, and as you know, having seen the film, they're pretty fabulous.
Yeah.
And they're all the more fabulous. Now they're teenagers and young adults, and they're looking back anywhere between 6 and 8 years later, because both films were stretched over a period of time. They're looking back and talking about, what worked for them, what didn't work for them, what they wish had happened,
Mhm.
and how they think about life in relation to this. And it's very profound, and it really is a deep teaching for all of us involved in supporting these families, because um, it's almost like a long-term study of these
Oh,
particular
yeah.
12 kids. And this is not a generic, kind of a bunch of kids. I mean, it ranges from Jonah, whose parents and their new partners and the whole extended family get together every holiday and go on holidays together too. Several of the kids who come from very high conflict families, who have become very alienated from one parent or another. That's something that happens that parents need to understand. And several of the kids say this in these high conflict situations where the kids feel like they're in the middle. When they get older, they are so exhausted by being in the middle of that fight that they end up actually choosing one parent or another.
Mm,
And it's just easier,
mm,
and
mhm.
they're just sick of the whole thing. And so there are two of the kids who are totally alienated from one of their parents because they just couldn't take it anymore. It's just like,
Yeah.
I'm sick of this war. I'm going into this camp and I'm just settling down there. And so, there is this way that this continued conflict is going to push your child away. They're either
Mhm.
going to want to get away from the both of you and get as far away from you as possible, or you're going to find a way to make them comfortable in this new paradigm,
Mhm.
where they feel loved and it's a comfortable, safe place for them to be in either household, and it's not a horrible situation where parents are coming together for a high school graduation or college
Right.
graduation or the new baby, or
Yeah.
you have to think long term here. Your
Mhm.
children may well have their own children.
Mhm.
And don't you want to be there at all of those wonderful events with your grandchild and have that be a comfortable situation and not have to watch the clock because
Yes.
the other parent is showing up in an hour and you've got to hightail out of there because everybody's going to be uncomfortable? Yeah. So,
Yep, yep. So I'm so in alignment with you there. And I'm so excited about that sequel because it sounds like there are going to be many, many more lessons that we can learn. And I just have to ask you, I mean, I love your heart. I want to thank you for what you're doing. It means so much to me and my clients and the world. And I hope that we can get you to come back and
oh,
talk about
sure.
the sequel. When
I
do you
would
think?
love to. Yeah.
Yay. When do you think that's coming out?
Uh, Probably early 2022. We're kind of in
Mhm.
the, yeah, we're getting there. It's all
All right.
shot. It's half edited. things like the animation take a little more time, and it's out of my hands. And so, I'm dependent on other people for that. So you can never tell the timeline exactly, but early in the year, it will be ready to roll. Yep.
Well, we will be, ready to see it. And we just thank you so much, Ellen, for being here today. And if anyone wants to find your films, your website will be in the show notes. It's Bruno Films. Is it brunofilms.com?
It is, but there's a website specifically for Split, and it's splitfilm.org.
All right. And I will put the trailer in the show notes too.
Great.
So
Great.
this was so great. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank
All
you
right,
both for
take
the work
care.
you're doing. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.